Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Spiritual Care Network webinar, The Spiritual Perspectives and Personality Functioning by Dr. Vaughn Bryant. Thank you, Dr. Bryant, for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad to be with you here, Eric.
We are waiting for our attendees to join, so we'll wait a few more minutes. Thanks, everybody, for logging in. I believe today we have people from all over Texas going to join our webinar for the Spiritual Care Network. We do have the audio and visual turned off for the attendees, but please feel free to use the chat box and announce where you're from and also the Q&A box so that we can address the questions at the end. This is sponsored today by the Spiritual Care Network and the J. Flowers Health Institute.
The J. Flowers Health Institute is providing your speaker for today.
There you go. No food, right? You're not going to have food delivered to everybody?
Well, I just heard we are going to get some fajitas here in about 30 minutes. So
I'll be right down.
If I start wrapping up early, I might be smelling the aroma of that good food out there.
Oh, my.
You know, what's fun is I've been doing a lot of these webinars lately, and sometimes during breaks, I'll pose the questions on the chat room. What are you having for a snack? And I did a webinar right here from our offices at the J. Flowers Health Institute, but the organization was over in Louisiana. And I'm telling you, they had some good snacks over there. There were people eating some crawfish, some jambalaya. It was making my mouth water.
You gotta love it. Well, good. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Thanks for joining today. The Spiritual Care Network webinar. I see a lot of good people all across Texas. Dr. Ann Worth joined us from Dallas. She just came out with a new book. We can talk to you about speaking at some point. And Aaron and Gail and Heather Moss, Carrie, a lot of good people joining us today. Wanda and Susan. Hi, Susan. So the Spiritual Care Network, if you don't know much about it or if you're new to the group, the purpose of the group is to bring together mental health professionals and faith leaders. We want to encourage spirituality in the treatment process and also be resources for the faith leaders in our churches and recovery group leaders, and all work together and bridge that gap. We do have a great website. It's spiritualcarenet.org. And actually, if you go to that website, you can see Dr. Bryant's presentation for today and also a handout that he's going to be talking about later. And we will probably be posting the presentation after the fact. When this is over, you're going to get a link to complete your evaluation and print off a certificate. Thank you to Brooke Martin for arranging that. And you're also going to get a follow-up email tomorrow with the same link. So if you miss it today, you can complete that tomorrow. My name is Eric Ailes. I work at Starlight Recovery Center. We brag that we're the oldest addiction treatment center in Texas, located in Center Point, Texas. And we are a residential drug and alcohol treatment program. And I'm happy to announce we are now accepting Medicaid. So yay. And we do have a Christian program called The Journey. Where we have a beautiful chapel on campus. We have weekend worship and opportunities through the week for our clients to do Bible studies through the Recovery Bible and put that spiritual aspect on recovery. So thanks for joining us today. And I guess we could go ahead and get started. What do you think, Vaughn? Are you ready to start rolling?
You bet. I'm ready to go. How about it? All right. Well, so hello to everybody. I had the opportunity to drop a couple messages out there, say hello to some of you there on the chat bubble. I've got the chat bubble open. I'm going to try to multitask. I hope I don't get too distracted. But I've been doing quite a few of these webinars on Zoom, and I've become familiar with some of the features. Eventually, once I get to my PowerPoint presentation, I'll take over control of the screen and I'll slide through the different PowerPoint slides as we go through the presentation. And the presentation today is going to be, it's titled Spiritual Perspectives in Personality Functioning. And I'll be telling you all about that in a moment. I think I might just talk for a little bit about the spiritual care network, my relationship with Eric, my involvement with the spiritual care network, as well as my work as a pastoral caregiver. So I'll probably take it all the way back to the very beginning, and I will put a disclaimer out at the beginning of this presentation, and that is I will share a lot of my own personal beliefs. They don't necessarily represent the ideas and opinions of the Spiritual Care Network, although Eric will probably tell you they do at the end. But I do want to get real with you and tell you about my journey and about my spiritual journey. And I don't want at all to impose that my way of thinking or my ideas or the way that I came to understand the integration of spiritual care, pastoral care, and psychology is the only way. But it is my way that I have found to be extremely useful, helpful over the years, and it's really been refined over the last 30 years. I think I'll start by going way, way back to the beginning, and that was when I was 19 years old and I was studying psychology. I was in my really probably my first or second year of college. I was at Northeast Louisiana University in Monroe, Louisiana. And I was lost. I was studying psychology, reading philosophy, trying to understand more about the meaning of life. And a very interesting thing happened one day as I approached a man that I was on the swim team at the Northeast Louisiana University. And there was a pastor from a local Baptist church who would come, and that was his physical exercise. He would come to the swimming pool and he would do swimming. And I remember one day kind of really in a place of knowing how lost and how just really dissatisfied with life that I was. And I asked this man who I knew was a pastor. He had invited us to his church. I was not really that religious at all. I did come from a family that had like an ethnic identity with a certain Christian religion. But as my father said, we were CEOs in terms of our relationship with the church. And I'm like, CEOs, we must be, the top dog there. He said, well, that means Christmas, Easter only. That's when we went to church. And I didn't go through any of the formal training. So I didn't fully comprehend or understand about faith or religion. But so I asked this pastor, I said, his name was Dr. Traylor. And I said, Dr. Traylor at First Baptist Church in Monroe, Louisiana. He was right there in our locker room. And I said, Dr. Traylor, I'm looking for God, but I don't know where to find him. And he told me, he said, well, have you ever read the Bible? And what was interesting is, I was thinking about all the classes I was taking in psychology and philosophy, all the literature and history that I've read throughout my education. And I told him, no, I've never read the Bible. And he said, well, if I gave you a copy of it, would you read it? And I said, certainly. And before he left, I asked him, well, where should I start? What page, what chapter is going to be on the test, so to speak. And he told me to read the Gospel John. And when the Bible came and I got my hands on it, I opened it up and I read the Gospel John. And there was one particular verse there in the first chapter, and it said that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And as I read the rest of the Gospel John, I realized that this mind that had searched for empirical or operational kind of strategies to implement philosophy to help people, I realized that the story of this man in the Bible, Jesus, was a real human being, and that these were historical facts. This was a document that was written, not too long ago that we actually have verifiable. Many theologians out there can tell you how many different primary sources verified the reality of these accounts. And so it touched me deeply, and I adopted Christianity as my worldview, as my faith tradition. And what was interesting, the reason I tell you that whole story was because when I got this, as the Psalm 51 says, restore unto me the joy of my salvation. I was so scared of death as a young man for fear of what that held. I had read about Dante's Inferno, and I didn't know which layer I'd end up on, but I was pretty certain I was headed down there because probably by the age of 3 or 4, I had violated a couple of the 10 commandments already. And that was all I really knew. I didn't know about redemption, but I felt free now. I felt this pathway toward freeing myself from these dysfunctional patterns that were in my life. And I found this very clear instruction on how to live a life that put me in a greater sense of harmony with my soul, and it put me in a greater sense of community and fellowship with others. And that changed my life. And so I went back, just having read the Gospel of John maybe about 2 weeks earlier, and I go to the pastor and I said, well, okay, Dr. Traylor, I'm called into the ministry. So do I need to transfer to a theology school? And he told me this. He said, you know, he asked me what I was doing in college and how did I come about picking that as a major, which was psychology. And he told me, he said, you know, Vaughn, we have plenty of theologians in the church, but we have very few people that have been trained in professional mental health care. So I recommend that you get your training and education in mental health, and then you bring that to the church. And so that's what I did. And it took about maybe 15 years from when we had that conversation until I was actually in full-time ministry. So I worked for the second 10 years of my professional career full-time in ministry at a mega church here in Houston, Christian, really evangelical, apostolic type of a church. It wasn't associated with any denomination. And I had a wonderful time there. I was the family life minister. I would do counseling, premarital counseling, family counseling. We did a lot of what we called our Family Life Institute education, helping people learn how to manage their emotions and things like that, as well as parenting. And so that was a wonderful experience. I did that for about 10 years. And then I went to work at a treatment center where I was the manager of spiritual care and staff development. And that was another wonderful experience. It was a treatment center that primarily worked with substance use disorder. And it was also very friendly with the 12-step model. So it was a 12-step integration model. I also did a spirituality group once a week, and I did a chapel service there. So for really the last 20 years of my career, it was in full-time pastoral care, integrating mental health care into that. And so now I'm here at the J. Flowers Health Institute. I might go ahead and switch to a share screen. But before I get into presentation, Eric asked me if I would be willing to say a prayer at the beginning. I know many of the spiritual care network meetings that I've been to before that we held live in person, always somebody would stand up and have a prayer. And so Eric asked me to say a prayer, which I'd love to do. So if you would join me for a moment in prayer. Dear God Almighty, we thank you for your presence in our life. We thank you for the power that you have filled us with to remain passionate about the work that we do and to have compassion for those who we care for. God, we ask that you always keep us humble, that you cause us to realize that every person who we interact with is a precious child of God who may be struggling, who may be going through a period of time where they're lost. And we pray that you will give us your words. We pray that you will give us your spirit of compassion and that you will give us the ability to help them. God, I pray for every person that has joined us today here in Zoom. I pray for the organizations who they represent. God, I ask that you continue to let peace and love and compassion reign in their lives and in their organization. Lord, cause them to have meaningful, enriched relationships with their coworkers so that we can all collaborate, that we can work together in unity. And it's in your precious name I pray. Amen. Amen. Well, so let's move into the presentation now. I will take over the control of the screen. Let's see how well I can do this. And go to the slideshow. All right, so how about somebody on the bubble just give me a little bubble there saying that you see the presentation now. Actually, I don't see my bubble popped up yet. I'll get there's the chat. I see 4 chats in here. Looks good. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. So welcome to our presentation today. The J. Flowers Health Institute here in the River Oaks area of Houston. We're located just inside the loop, the Interstate 610 loop right here in the Galleria area, River Oaks area, right off of San Felipe. And we specialize in providing comprehensive health and wellness evaluations for individuals who want to improve their quality of life. Every client receives personal one-on-one concierge care, and they stay in a luxury accommodation, and they get a workable plan for future health. We utilize the resources here in the Texas Medical Center. We have over 12 providers. About 4 or 5 of them are here in our office Monday through Friday, as well as another 6 or 8 providers that our clients will go to. They'll be driven there by one of our concierge care specialists. And those might be other types of procedures that are part of their comprehensive diagnostic evaluation, which includes psychometric testing, neuropsych testing, health and wellness evaluation, a full executive physical health kind of evaluation, as well as other kinds of specialized or specialty types of evaluation that might be appropriate considering their concern or what they've come to. And after we do this comprehensive evaluation, and we have spent at least 40 hours with the client, we have a very in-depth understanding of what are at the core of their disturbance. And usually we're able to develop a plan that really focuses in like the precision of a laser to be able to identify and to give them some strategies on how to recover or overcome from that. And we work with all types of disorders. It really just opened the DSM from page 1 to page 852, whatever the last page is. We cover the full spectrum. So let's move now into the presentation for today. And there's 2 parts to this presentation. Actually, there may be 3. I think it's 2. The first part, I'm going to be talking about understanding personality functioning. And then the second part, I'm going to be talking about spiritual virtues and how we use that idea, that concept in our therapy with people who have less than optimal personality functioning. I'm going to begin by talking about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Here it is right there. I pulled out the copy of it for you. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because the DSM-5, which was published in 2013, presented an alternative model for personality disorders. And this alternative model for personality disorders, it's found right there in the back. Hopefully you can focus in on that page right there. It's page 761. And I probably am kind of a geek about this, but when the DSM-5 came out, I did go and get it that day, got it at Barnes & Noble, paid the full $212 for that hardback copy. You can get them on eBay now, bidding for, 30, 40, 50 bucks if you're lucky, if you're the lucky bidder. But I got it when it was first released, particularly because I had heard this discussion about personality disorders and how there was this new model, this alternative model for personality disorders that was included in the back of the book. Now, they kept the DSM-4 model for diagnosing personality disorders, and they kept it in the main section of the DSM-5, but they put this in the back and presented two very useful tables in there. One of them was the table. Now, I would have made copies of these and sent them to you, but because the American Psychiatric Association wanted me to pay $212 for pages 761 and 781, they probably want you to pay $212 for those pages too. So it would have violated a copyright for me to photocopy them. But if you'll just bear with me for a moment here, I'm going to pull the, it's on page 775. I'll show you the table here. There it is right there. It's called Table 2, and this is the level of personality functioning scale. So if you have your DSM-5, you could open that up right there. And it really, what was most impressive to me about this is that so much of the DSM gave us a standard for diagnosing a person with illness. This model gives us a standard for knowing what does a healthy personality functioning look like. And so in the scale, they have 4 different levels. And the first level would be 0 to 1, which means little to no impairment. And I'm going to describe what little to no impairment in personality functioning looks like. So it presents that framework for understanding personality functioning and how it impacts one's perception of self, as well as how they relate to others. The model also has another table in it, which is found on page 779. And these are some very useful definitions of these disordered personality traits. And there's about 28 or 30 of these disordered personality traits in there. And it gives a very clear definition of what that trait is, like manipulativeness. So many of us in our clinical work will hear people talk about, well, he's just manipulating. Well, there's a very clear definition of what manipulativeness looks like. And that's actually one of my slides here later on in this module of the presentation. So I want to begin with a discussion of how personality develops. You know, everyone has personality, and some person's personality is disordered. It causes problems for them. It causes problem in their emotional or in their cognitive world. It also causes problems in their relationship. So let's look at how personality develops, which will also give us insight onto how to help people change personality. So personality development is influenced by biology and the social environment. Any of you who have ever been around a large family where children may have been born in very close chronology to each other, you'll see that 2 children or 3 or 4 children who were born into the same family at basically the same point in history have these very distinctively different temperaments when they're even very young children. Sometimes temperament is, well, temperament, it really represents that aspect of their personality that appears as early as infancy. So temperament is that raw material really that ends up creating this trajectory that personality develops on. And the thing about just about every trait of personality, let's say, for example, talkativeness, that might be an example in temperament. Some children, they have good mastery of language and verbal communication, but they just don't say many words. So talkativeness, now then there's other children who have good mastery, or maybe they don't have good mastery of language, but they say a whole lot of words. And the thing about talkativeness or verbal communication is that when it is expressed in a useful or kind of in the middle path, it can be very helpful at communicating their wants and needs, being taken seriously. I think if we think of the old proverb, or maybe it's an Aesop's fable, it's the one about the boy who cried wolf. That's a perfect example of how crying wolf the first time was effective, and it drew all of the townspeople to help this child out, but there was no threat. But after over and over crying wolf and there was no threat, what happened is the other people in his community didn't take him seriously. So that might be another example there of how these different traits of our temperament, they can be useful, but when they exist out here on the extreme, they become dysfunctional and they're not useful. And that's where we see personality disorders. Interpersonal style is influenced by temperament. Interpersonal style develops throughout childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. Some of you that have actually worked with personality disorder diagnosis, some of you have read through the different diagnostic criteria, and some of these, some of the descriptions of different personality disorders will have a qualifier in the diagnostic criteria saying that basically be very careful about diagnosing this personality disorder in adolescence or in childhood, because really these traits represent immaturity, and it wouldn't really be abnormal for a child or an adolescent to have the emotion dysregulation or other kind of things like that. But once a person establishes a sense of self in adulthood, that's when personality is pretty much formalized in adulthood. The transition from adolescence to adulthood, it's that time the person harmonizes temperament, life experience, and social skills to solidify their personality. I noticed that there were a bunch of chat comments. I don't know if people were just checking in. Yep, I don't see any questions in there yet. Okay. Yeah, some people were asking about where to find that. The version of the DSM-5 that I'm using is the big book, the big one with the hardcover. I also have one of those small desk reference ones. It does not have that level of personality functioning scale in it or the alternative model. So you need to get the hardback one. If I were to take the dust cover off, it looks like this. I might even show you the ISBN number. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not going to lick my fingers because of infection control. There we go. Here's the ISBN number. If y'all want to try to write that down, I'll try to hold it still for a moment. Okay, that concludes our test of the emergency broadcasting. All right, so back to business here. This right here is a illustration that I wanted to present to show you these domains of personality functioning. So in the alternative model for understanding personality and personality disorders, we have two main domains that we are assessing or evaluating or observing when it is that we are assessing or evaluating someone for a personality disorder. One domain is self, and within that domain of their self, there are these two facets. One of them is identity and the other is self-direction. I'm going to define those extensively here in a couple moments. But basically, identity is, who are you? Who am I? And self-direction is what motivates me. And then the other domain we have is interpersonal. And the two major facets, the two facets under interpersonal is empathy and intimacy. Intimacy is that ability to connect with other people in a deep, enduring, and meaningful way. And empathy is that ability to really get outside of yourself and try and see the world from another person's perspective. So here's a definition of those two terms, which did come from the DSM-5. So in the self domain, identity, it includes the experience of oneself as unique with clear boundaries between self and others. So there's a key word right there, boundaries, unique. It's also stability of self-esteem and accuracy of self-appraisal. Now let me give you the example of stability of self-esteem. So if I have really looked within myself and I know that my character is compassionate, and that compassion may have motivated me to do something like bring a birthday card to a friend in the office. So that might be an act of compassion, of love. Now, it's quite possible, though, that another person in the office witnesses me give that person a card, and they think to themselves, well, Vaughn is he just plays favorites because my birthday was last week and he didn't do anything good for me. So stability of self-esteem might be the way the gift giver feels when their gift maybe isn't appreciated. Someone with the stability of self-esteem is motivated, down on number 2 in self-direction, they're motivated out of love, and it really doesn't matter to them how that other person receives the gift or whether they appreciate it or whether someone else criticizes them about it. It may affect them briefly, but it's not going to fundamentally alter their self-esteem. But what we see in personality disorders is person's identity sometimes is so unstable that their self-esteem is all dependent upon the context where they are. It's all dependent on their performance, or it's all dependent on the validation and affirmation they get from others. But with a secure sense of self, a stability of self-esteem, a person has this internal reference of who they are and the esteem of their self. And it's not going to be, although they should be empathic when people want to criticize them or judge them, but it's not going to fundamentally alter their self-esteem if someone doesn't validate them in the way that they might have expected. Also with identity, there's this capacity for an ability to regulate a range of emotional experiences. Under self-direction, the facet of self, it's the pursuit of coherent and meaningful short-term and life goals, the utilization of constructive and pro-social internal standards of behavior, this ability to self-reflect productively. Now, I want to talk just a moment here about passion and purpose. I think it may even be kind of like the motto in our school district. I've seen those words a lot. But I heard a great TED talk. I cannot even remember the name of the speaker. And she talked about passion and purpose. And one of the things that she said is that passion is really not what makes people happy in life, but it's purpose. And that really passion, like I've worked with so many young adults who are passionate about music, but it doesn't really result in a paycheck. And if the passion is self-centered, not other-directed, so like if the reason why I'm passionate about music is because I just want to be out there on the stage and I want everyone to hear me sing, that's very self-serving and self-centered. I want to make a lot of money. I want to be famous. I want to be a celebrity. Like Gaga said, it's for the applause. Well, that may be passion, but that's not purpose. What is your purpose? There's some great musicians who will tell you their purpose is to move people emotionally, to help people get in touch with their emotions and to experience life in a fuller degree. That's a person whose passion is aligned with their purpose, and they're going to experience a very clear sense of self-direction. So be mindful of that when talking about passion. You know, I'm passionate about football, or I'm passionate about music. Well, passion sometimes can result in some very unproductive outcomes, whereas purpose, on the other hand, not only does it result in productive outcomes, but it also results in this deeply gratifying sense of self, because you know who you are, you know what motivates you, and you can align your actions and your attitudes in the direction to fulfill that purpose. The other dimension of personality is interpersonal domain. Interpersonal domain has these two facets. One of them is empathy, which is the comprehension and appreciation of others' experiences and motivations. Also tolerance of differing perspectives, as well as understanding the effect of one's own behaviors on others. And then you see intimacy. This is another facet, this deep and enduring connection with others, a desire and capacity for closeness, this mutuality of regard reflected in interpersonal behavior. So all four of these facets, two of these facets of self, which is identity and self-direction, as well as these two facets of interpersonal empathy and intimacy, there is what I just presented was the description of little to no impairment in those domains. So if the client reflects what I just discussed, then there's no personality disorder there. There's no impairment in personality functioning. But if you do want to get that DSM-5 and read through the levels, you'll see how disordered people's personality, their sense of self, and their relationship with others can be. So in the other table, which I think was around page 779 in the DSM-5, is a list of personality traits or disordered personality traits. And they use these personality traits to describe different personality disorders. So the criteria, the diagnostic criteria of a personality disorder in the DSM-5 alternative view or alternative model for personality functioning, what you'll see is first, you have to establish that there is impairment in their personality functioning through those two domains and those four facets. Next, you would establish that they have these personality traits present in the way they think about themselves or the way they relate to others, the way they experience emotion. Now, there's about 28 of them listed in that table. I'm not going to go over a lot of them, but I wanted to present a few of them because I am going to present a comparison of virtues, spiritual virtues, that can counteract or can be an antidote or it can be a correction for the negative personality trait. So that's the purpose of me presenting these. And I'm going to accelerate myself through these slides. Again, the slides are available to you. They have been posted at the Spiritual Care Network. I've also put an article out there, a very brief 3 or 4 page article about spiritual disciplines that might also be helpful for you. It operationalized some of the practice of spiritual growth and spiritual development. So negative affectivity, frequent and intense experience of high levels of a wide range of negative emotions, anxiety, depression, guilt, shame, worry, anger, and their behavioral and interpersonal manifestations. Emotional labile or emotionally labile, lability. Now, you'll notice at the bottom of this slide, I put BP. Now, this symptom is actually listed as one of the symptoms of borderline personality disorder. So emotionally labile, instability of emotional experience and mood, emotions that are easily aroused, intense, and are out of proportion to events and circumstances. This would be an example of when someone says something like, I'm having a crisis, I'm having a crisis. Okay, what happened? What's going on? Well, I was just snapping with this guy that I'm really trying to, hook up with, and my phone died, my battery's dead. I don't know what to do. Okay, that's a little bit of, extreme emotional experience right there that's out of proportion to the events and the circumstances. But that would be an example of that emotionally labile, is that the emotions are just blown like the tatter of a flag. Anxiousness, feelings of nervousness, tenseness, or panic in reaction to diverse situations, frequent worry about the negative effects of past unpleasant experiences and future negative possibilities, feeling fearful and apprehensive about uncertainty, expecting the worst to happen. Again, that's another trait of the borderline personality disorder. Separation insecurity, fears of being alone due to rejection and or separation from significant others, based in a lack of confidence in one's ability to care for self, both physically and emotionally. Again, when a person has a secure sense of self, they're very comfortable being alone. But when they have an insecure sense of self, that seems to be tied into or dependent upon the interaction, feedback, or affirmation they get from others, there's a high level of separation and insecurity, because the sense of self is so undefined that they really not only don't know who they are, but they are afraid of not being in the presence of someone else. Hostility, I put these up here too. I put BP, which is borderline personality, as well as antisocial personality. Hostility is one of those traits. Persistent or frequent angry feelings, anger or irritability in response to minor slights and insults, mean, nasty, or vengeful behavior. Detachment, avoidance of socioeconomic experience, including withdrawal from interpersonal interactions, from friendships, restricted affective experience and expression, particularly limited hedonic capacity. Hedonic capacity, it has to do with your capacity to experience joy or pleasure. Anhedonia, which is that fancy word, now you got the definition, you've probably heard it or used it before, but it's this lack of enjoyment from or engagement in or energy of life or for life's experiences. It's the deficits in the capacity to feel pleasure and take interest in things. This is also one of the symptoms of major depressive disorder. Depressivity, another symptom of the borderline personality disorder. Feelings of being down, miserable, and or hopeless, difficulty from recovering from such moods, pessimism about the future, pervasive shame and or guilt, feelings of inferior self-worth, thoughts of suicide or suicidal behavior. Suspiciousness, it's this idea that you're out to get me, this sensitivity to, or this tendency to interpret other people's behavior with ill intent or harm. Doubt about loyalty and fidelity of others. This is where jealousy comes in right here. That's another kind of way of describing jealousy. Antagonism, behaviors that put the individual at odds with other people, exaggerating sense of self-importance. You know, one of the terms that I've used to kind of describe some of the things that I've seen kind of like in political discussion is what I would call idealistic narcissism. And it's this idea, you know, one of the traits of the narcissistic personality disorder is it's about attention seeking and grandiosity. Those are the two traits of the narcissistic personality disorder. And the idea with grandiosity is that I know better than you, and you should do what I tell you. Everybody should do as the way I say because I know better than everyone else. And there's this thing that happens sometimes when people have this idealistic sense of self or in their message, and it can create a lot of antagonism. Not only do I know best, but everyone should do as I say. That's antagonism, exaggerated sense of self-importance, and this concomitant expectation of special treatment, as well as a callous antipathy toward others, encompassing both an awareness of others. In other words, if people believe differently than you, then you have the right to be callous toward them. And that really is not good personality functioning, nor is it very harmonious sense of community or a spiritual virtue at all. Manipulativeness, there's the definition. You probably need a dictionary again to define subterfuge, but that's kind of being sneaky, you know. The use of subterfuge to influence or control others, the use of seduction, charm, glibness, or ingratiation to achieve one's end. That right there is the AS. I think that might, well, I can't remember what I put for AS there. Maybe it's another antisocial. Maybe. Deceitfulness, dishonesty, and fraudulence. Grandiosity, again, that's the narcissistic personality disorder. Attention seeking, that's another trait. That's a trait of the narcissistic personality disorder. Callousness, this lack of concern for the feelings or problems of others. Lack of guilt or remorse about the negative or harmful effects of one's actions on others. Disinhibition. I'm going to scroll through these rather quickly because I want to get to the end. There we go. Spiritual virtues. That was a lot of negativity there, or vice. What I'm presenting to you now for the rest of this presentation is this notion that there are these vices, which are these negative traits of the human experience, of personality. They're vices. And then you have virtues. And the way that you resolve the vice, it's not simply stop doing the vice. It's not simply stop being callous, but it's start being loving or compassionate. And we see these messages and we see very clear instructions about this in spiritual or spirituality oriented types of messaging or sacred texts. So let me try and define in a universal way about spirituality and virtue. Spirituality, it's a protective factor, motivating people to think beyond the here and now and outside of self as they strive for some greater meaning in life and a deeper connection with the community and with the sacred. Virtue, it's a positive trait of human expression that enhances the person's well-being and contributes to harmonious relationship with others and the environment. That's what virtue is. It's these traits in personality. It has to do with a person's sense of motivation. And then that gets manifest in the way they interact with others. So if you think of love as being a virtue, it is going to motivate the way that I interact with other people, and it will have to do with empathy and intimacy. So these spiritual virtues have the potential to reach a person, to enhance their functioning in both the self and the interpersonal dimension or domain of personality functioning, and all four of those facets of self, their identity, their self-direction, empathy, and intimacy. Spiritual virtues are universal principles described in sacred text, philosophical writings, and passed on through generations and culture. A couple sources. I'm very familiar with the 12-step recovery fellowship. The 12 steps have been referred to as a spiritual path. And there, at one point, some of you may, those of you particularly that are very familiar with the 12 steps, you may have heard about the 12 principles, the 12 spiritual principles. I just printed this off the internet. You'll see their author unknown. But I was trying to figure out, where did all these come from? Because there's not a place in the big book that says these are 12 principles. It's got 12 steps and 12 traditions, but these 12 principles, from what I heard from reading some research, is that it was a plaque that was posted in many AA fellowship halls. And these 12 spiritual principles include honesty, hope, faith, courage, integrity, willingness, humility, love, discipline, patience, perseverance, awareness, service. If you want a copy of that, just go online, one of your search engines, look up the 12 principles, 12 spiritual virtues of AA. You'll find that there. So spiritual virtues, they're universal. I also have referenced, I'm very familiar with the Bible. I'm going to read a passage, if you will indulge me for a moment here. Here's an example of virtue being described in sacred text right here. And this is in Galatians chapter 5, verse number 22. And it says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. So that's another example of these virtues that are represented in spiritual or in sacred text. So let's go through a few of these. I didn't make a list of 12. I actually can't remember exactly how many are on this list that I put together here, but the list could probably go on a long way. So these are some that I've identified that have application to correct those disordered personality traits. I'm going to drop into the chat room, see if I've missed anything here lately. Okay, very good. Thank you. Love. I really believe that this is the most essential, it's the most vital. It is the essence of spiritual virtue, love. Love, I took the definition from a book that was written by Scott Peck. It's called The Road Less Traveled. It's my favorite definition of love. I could have gone into scriptures and Corinthians. There's a beautiful passage there. We often read it at wedding ceremonies. But I like the way Dr. Peck presents it here because he really captures this idea about sacrifice. Love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose to nurture your own or another person's spiritual growth. So that's one aspect, a big aspect of love. It's about extending yourself. It's about sacrifice. Peace, it's freedom from strife and distress in thought and emotion. Patience, the capacity to manage difficult circumstances calmly and without complaint. Self-control, it's this discipline to restrain impulses. Joy, the emotional experience of being well. Faith is complete confidence, belief, and trust. Intimacy, and I use the DSM to define this one, depth and duration of connection. I talked about that earlier. Kindness, to be helpful with a pleasant demeanor. Honesty, fairness and straightforwardness of conduct, adherence to the facts. Hope, to expect with desire something on which hopes are centered. Humility is not proud or haughty, not arrogant or assertive, a clear and concise understanding of who I am, what we are, followed by a sincere desire to become what you are potentially. Empathy, the comprehension and appreciation of others' experiences. Now I'm going to present about 3 slides here, 2 slides, to illustrate how this spiritual virtue can be applied to these areas where a person's negative or disordered personality trait manifests. Now, let me say a few things about working with a person who has a personality disorder. I have heard throughout my career people have negative opinions about personality disorders. They've also, I've heard many times in the mental health care industry some very negative and stigmatizing attitudes directed toward people with personality disorders. And I just want to declare today that's not my view. I believe that people with personality disorders are worthy of our love, our affection, our care, our compassion. And I also believe that we can be effective as mental health care providers to help them to recover from their personality disorder. I do believe personality disorders can be resolved. Now, I will say this, because of at their core, they have to do with self and interpersonal dynamics, that the person who has the personality disorder, they have to participate in the change process. Some of you are familiar with intervention, where a person who has a substance use disorder can basically be kidnapped and taken to a treatment center, and they will be forced into sobriety. That works to get people sober sometimes. It doesn't really work with a personality disorder, because humility, I do believe, and empathy are they're the spark that starts the fire of recovery for a person with a personality disorder. There has to be this humility within themselves to acknowledge their disordered personality. And I have found that a frontal, judgmental, critical attack on their personality usually does not work. Instead, what happens is if I can form a therapeutic alliance with the person who has a personality disorder and be strategic in my questions so that I might be able to help them to discover or reveal or gain insight about their disordered trait, then they may open up with a willingness to change that. So instead of saying that's a bad personality trait and you have to change it, I might see evidence of this personality trait like impulsivity. And I might say, okay, well, so what you just described, that's what we would call impulsivity. I'm just kind of curious, how has that worked for you? That's a great question that when delivered with the right kind of timing, when a person's open, maybe they're talking about some impulsive act that they feel guilty about. I say, well, so how has that worked for you? Well, it really, really hadn't worked for me. I've gotten myself in a lot of trouble. When they answer like that, now we have an opening to help them to make a commitment to a different way of being. So let's start with negative affectivity, and the virtue is peace. Now, I'll say this too. I've heard about peace or about courage. It's not the absence of some kind of noise or fearful thing in the environment, but it's more, peace is more a description of an internal condition, even in the midst of very crisis or unstable or very difficult circumstances. Now, my therapeutic approach is also very heavy with dialectical behavior therapy. Dialectical behavior therapy, although it's not really identified as a spiritual practice, the whole dependence on mindfulness and on meditation. There's also some very clear examples of the use of spirituality in DBT therapy in the Linehan's Dialectical Behavior Therapy Skills Training Manual. So the dialectical behavior therapy, particularly the mindfulness and the distress tolerance skill sets, have these kinds of virtues weaved into them. So we have the virtue of peace, we have the virtue of self-control, which can be applied to this emotionally labile or impulsivity. Now, many of you who come to the Spiritual Care Network, who come to our workshops, who participate in the fellowship and on the Facebook and the collaboration, many of you I know personally, and I know your practice, and how many of us will identify ourselves as pastoral caregivers or as Christian counselors. And what I have found is that when the client seeks out what they call Christian counseling or spiritual counseling, this also increases their confidence in this approach right here. Particularly when you can reference, if a person comes in asking for Christian counseling, and you can reference these virtues from some principle from their sacred text, it adds validity to this approach. And maybe if their motivation is to be more consistent with their core values, it might increase the likelihood that they'll engage in these practices. Intimacy is a virtue that can offset or correct separation and insecurity and detachment. Kindness is a virtue that can offset hostility. It can correct this trait of hostility. Empathy can offset antagonism. Joy can offset anhedonia. Hope can offset depressivity and suspiciousness. Honesty is that virtue that can offset manipulativeness and deceitfulness. Humility can offset grandiosity and attention seeking. both of those symptoms, grandiosity and attention seeking, are the two symptoms of the narcissistic personality disorder. Humility and empathy are the cure for the narcissistic personality disorder. Love is the antidote for callousness. Now, I went through all of those traits there and explained them. I want you to know that I did present I did include an article for you to read. It's about spiritual discipline. It's about the practice of these. But if you want to talk just, real practical about how do you practice these, mindfulness meditation is the main thing right there. Mindfulness is to remain in this state of connection to the here and now, fully aware of myself and the impact that myself is having on other people. That's to be in a state of mindfulness. And when in a state of mindfulness, I'm not motivated by impulses. I'm not driven by impulses, but instead I'm motivated by my core values, these virtues. And so even though I may feel uncomfortable, but my core value is to have patience or self-control, then I am not going to be disgruntled. I'm not going to be upset. I have come to the last minute or two of this presentation, and I am going to bring that to an end. I'm going to stop sharing for this moment. I think, Eric, you're back in control. Does that sound right? Are you still with us here?
Here I am. Good job. Thank you.
All right. Let's see. I have a couple. Notes here. Let's see if there were questions. There was one question about attachment theory as it relates to personality disorders. That would probably be a whole nother presentation. I've heard a few good colleagues of mine. I know Ava Pravada has written some things on that. She might be out there. I don't know if she is, but it has everything to do with what I discussed in the beginning about how that biosocial theory and how early childhood experiences influence a person's personality. It'll have everything to do with their sense of intimacy with others and connection with others. But again, I believe that attachment can be repaired. And I also believe that the therapeutic alliance that a therapist has with their client can be an atmosphere where the attachment can be repaired with that loving and compassionate, caring, and empathic relation. All right, that answered the question. I'm going to hand it over to you, Eric. Thank you.
Great. And there was just one more comment that Linda said about the DBT and spirituality and mindfulness. She's glad that you brought that up, and it's pretty important. Well, great. Well, thanks. We have people from all over the U.S. actually on the webinar today. So thanks everybody for joining us. You will get a link in just a few minutes.
There's a serenity prayer.
I like that. You'll get a link in a few minutes to complete your evaluation online and then print off your certificate. You also get an email tomorrow with the same link, and please fill that out for us. If you want to see this presentation and his handout or the article that he talked about earlier, you can find it on the Spiritual Care Network website, which is spiritualcarenet.org. Also, you can donate there on the same website. So if you feel inclined to give us a donation, we'll accept it. We do have some more great presentations coming up in the next few weeks. So stay tuned. If you're not on our mailing list, you can sign up online or email me, and I will be glad to add you. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. That concludes our webinar, and blessings to you all. Take care.
All right.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thanks
Thank you,
for
Vaughn.
joining.